following program is brought to you in living color on NBC.
With the basic concept and philosophy of manifest destiny, the United States of America launched itself into the Mexican-American War in 1846. This war is shrouded in myths, legends, and half-truths. What are the reasons for concealing the purpose of this aggressive action on the part of the United States of America? What caused the war? What were the actual motives other than manifest destiny that actually led the United States of America into a declaration of war against Mexico? Who was at fault? What does the act of aggression mean to the Mexican-American or Chicano resident of the United States of America today? As your narrator for this program, I will answer many of these questions. I am Francisco Cruz, Associate Professor on the staff of Chicano Studies Department at California State College at Long Beach, California. Students of American history, foreign policy, and diplomacy are often confused by inconsistencies in accounts of the Mexican-American War. Morality frequently becomes confused in the propaganda of an historical period. Wars of aggression always are based on a rationale of rhetoric, making it difficult to distinguish between the policies of Alexander the Great, Napoleon Bonaparte, Adolf Hitler's Lebensraum, and the corrupt manifest destiny of President James K. Polk. This was Mexico in 1821 after she had gained independence from Spain. In 1846, Mexico was invaded by armies of the United States in an aggressive war for territory. In 1848, Mexico was forced to bid farewell to one half of her territory and many of her citizens as a result of la guerra contra los Estados Unidos, the first major imperialistic war by the United States against a foreign nation. The desire for territory by the United States was evidenced by the Mexican scholar José Tornel, who wrote, quote, "For more than 50 years, that is, from the very beginning of their political infancy, the prevailing thought of the United States of America has been the acquisition of the greater part of the territory once belonging to Spain, particularly that part which today belongs to Mexico," unquote. Tornel's apprehension about the interest of the United States was evidenced as early as 1790, when Nolan was sent to explore the territory of Texas. His discoveries created an onslaught of filibustering. The policy of the United States permitted squatters to move into what they considered Indian territory, settle on it, then ask for annexation as a state. This was to become known as the Texas Game. One of these freebooters, James Long, was captured and shot for violation of Mexican law on Mexican territory. Stephen Austin brought a group of settlers into Texas under a grant from the government of Mexico. Austin and the settlers agreed to become Mexican citizens and abide by Mexican law. As Mexican citizens, they were subject to the articles of the grant that stipulated: 1, they would become Catholics; 2, pledge allegiance to Mexico; 3, each family was to receive 177 acres of land for farming; and 4,428 acres of grazing land. No slavery was allowed after 1829. Instead, they flagrantly brought in slaves in open violation of the Mexican Constitution. In 1830, Secretary of Foreign Relations Lucas Alamán encouraged Mexicans to colonize in the Texas territory. The Americans complained of the Mexicans taking over, declared independence, and rallied the people with the cry, "Remember the Alamo." When a band of Texans took over that fort, when they refused to surrender to a numerically superior Mexican force, all were killed. At San Jacinto, the final battle of the Texas Revolt, General Santana was captured and bartered his life for an agreement of Texas independence. The Congress of Mexico refused to ratify or recognize the treaty. Battles do not illuminate the intrigues of governments in wartime. The United States, while officially disavowing involvement in the Texas Revolt, had done nothing to stop the flow of men and arms into that territory. In addition, the newspapers of that time were pressing for Texas annexation. One, the Philadelphia Evening Star, said, "Texas, sooner or later, from its position, must become the property of the United States." President Andrew Jackson, however fearful of confirming the suspicion of the United States' involvement in the Texas Revolt, delayed until his last day in office to accede to the demands of his friends for official recognition of the Republic of Texas. This laid the foundation for annexation, which Mexico had declared she would consider an act of war. Anticipating Jackson's plans and the consequences of such action, former President John Quincy Adams warned the Congress, stating, quote, "Your war, sir, is to be a war of the races, the Anglo-Saxon against the Moorish Mexican. What will be the causes of such a war? Aggression, conquest, and the establishment of slavery where it has been abolished," unquote. The abolition of slavery in Mexico was declared by Miguel Hidalgo in 1810 in his famous Grito de Dolores. It was adopted into law as part of the Constitution of Mexico. This law was violated by the settlers in Texas, who brought their slaves with them. They came from the slave states in the South. Their politicians pushed constantly for annexation, seeking to widen the loathsome trade and institutional slavery. Land speculators were quick to take advantage of the opportunity for profit in the territory of Texas as another facet of the Texas game. Many political figures were involved in the speculation in Texas land scrip. In 1839, John L. O'Sullivan, editor of the New York Democratic Review, published an editorial titled "The Great Nation of Futurity," in which he defined the high ideals of the American Republic as stated in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The policy of manifest destiny was based on this article and a subsequent one in which he wrote, quote, "The rights and happiness of many will prevail. Democracy must finally reign. There is in man an eternal principle of progress which no power on earth may resist. It is contending for the extinction of tyranny," unquote. Bernard DeVoto, author of The Year of Decision 1846, wrote that, quote, "The American had always devoutly believed that the superiority of their institutions, government, and mode of life would eventually spread by inspiration and imitation to the less fortunate, less happy peoples. That devout belief now took on a new phase. It was perhaps the American destiny to spread our free and admirable institutions by action as well as by example, by occupying territory as well as by practicing virtue. This idealistic concept of the American Constitution was seized upon and corrupted to their own use by the advocates of expansionism. This greed for additional territory became so prominent throughout the United States that it prompted the explorer of the Pacific Coast, Charles Wilkes, to suggest the union of the Oregon Territory and Alta California, a Mexican province. Wilkes wrote, quote, "This future state is admirably situated to become a powerful maritime nation, with the finest ports in the world that lie between the Straits of Juan de Fuca and that magnificent harbor at San Diego. This western coast, possessed as it must be by the Anglo-Norman race, is evidently destined to fill a large space in the world's future history," unquote. President John Tyler in 1844 appealed for the annexation of Texas in a message to Congress with an eye to further expansion in territories. He stated, "But if there were any force in the objection, it would seem to require an immediate abandonment of territorial possessions which lie in the distance and stretch to a far-off sea, and yet no one would be found, it is believed, ready to recommend such an abandonment. Texas lies at our very doors and in our immediate vicinity." Henry Clay led the Senate to reject the initial attempt for annexation of Texas, but a later joint resolution of Congress was gladly signed by Taylor as he turned the presidency over to James K. Polk. James Polk was so dedicated to the policy of manifest destiny and greedy for land to the west that he conspired with adventurers, both military and political, to achieve his goals. The plots for more land had gone on for years. The racist ideas of leaders in America convinced them that the Mexicans were so naive as to accept any rationale. In an attempt to buy Texas from Mexico in 1825, President John Quincy Adams instructed his agent to say, quote, "If they will sell Texas, the capital of Mexico will be closer to the center of the country," unquote. President Jackson had employed duplicity in his plot to gain the Texas territory. He instructed his minister to Mexico, Anthony Butler, to burn the secret letter of instructions for deceiving the Mexican president. Daniel Webster, as Secretary of State under Tyler, ordered Waddy Thompson to secure some arrangement in California for his sailing and whaling constituents in the Yankee Clippers. Wrote Webster, quote, "The utility of a good port on the western end of the continent in those latitudes for the commerce and fisheries of the United States is sufficiently obvious," unquote. John Calhoun was later appointed Secretary of State by Tyler, and although opposed to a war, desired the annexation of Texas as a slave state, claiming manifest destiny. He wrote to the French government, quote, "If the annexation should take place peaceably, the energies of our people would be directed to bringing within the pales of civilization the large portion of the continent lying between Mexico on one side and the British possessions on the other," unquote. Calhoun also was forced to disown any official status on the part of his son's father-in-law, Duff Green, who had been plotting in Texas. Appointed counsel to Galveston by Calhoun, he went to Mexico City instead and negotiated for the purchase of Texas after nearly a decade of de facto Texas independence. This led to a charge by Mexico that the Texas game was a plot engineered by the United States. James Polk stated that the acquisition of California was one of the 4 great measures to be accomplished by his administration. He does not mention the annexation of Texas, although this was the issue which won him the support of Jackson for the nomination and the principal issue of the campaign. Buchanan, Polk's Secretary of State, was alarmed at the militaristic posturing of the president. Polk, impatient at the secretary's hesitancy about war, characterized Buchanan as, quote, "a man who acts in small matters without judgment and sometimes acts like an old maid." In his inaugural address, Polk insulted the Mexican government by stating that the question of Texas belongs exclusively to the United States and Texas, unquote. Shortly thereafter, Mexico broke off diplomatic relations with the United States for taking a stand on the state in revolt against Mexico. Polk found a man very willing to be a partner in his scheming. Robert F. Stockton, who had distinguished himself by amassing a fortune through his monopoly of railroads and canals in New Jersey. He had the financial resources, a righteous belief in manifest destiny, and the experience and clever political manipulation necessary to Polk's plotting. Ordered to Veracruz to join the naval ships previously positioned there, belligerently Stockton instead anchored his squadron of vessels at Galveston. Although his orders read that he should make himself acquainted with the dispositions of the people of Texas, his true purpose was shown in the report of Anson Jones, president of Texas. On May 28, General Sherman of the Texas Militia and Dr. Wright, secretary to Stockton, proposed that I should authorize Sherman to raise a force of 2,000 men and make a descent on the Mexican town of Matamoros, which Stockton would support with naval vessels, transport, and finance. This would establish Texas hostility to Mexico so that annexation would bring a war between Mexico and the United States. It was desirable that it would appear to the world as Stockton's individual enterprise. I was given to understand that the government of the United States was in reality at the bottom of it," unquote. An offer of peace came from Mexico at this time, and Jones rejected Stockton's plot. Quote, "I assured him I never had the least idea of manufacturing a war for the United States." Soon after, he left and sailed for the Pacific in search of the same unpacific object which had brought him to Texas, unquote. Regarding President Polk, Jones wrote, quote, "Polk brought down an army and navy on us when there was not a hostile foot, either Indian or Mexican, in Texas. This was done not to protect Texas, but to ensure a collision with Mexico," unquote. Now, the only possible way for Polk to provoke war with Mexico was through the boundary dispute of the Rio Grande. Although there were numerous precedents for consideration of the Nueces River as the legitimate boundary, Polk ignored these and insisted on the illegal and unfounded claim of the boundary at the Rio Grande. On April 12, 1846, Polk ordered a naval blockade at the mouth of the Rio Grande. This was the second indisputable act of war. Taylor was finally successful in provoking a skirmish between American and Mexican troops on Mexican soil, April the 25th, and sent a message to Polk stating, quote, "You can consider that hostilities have definitely commenced." Polk, delighted that his plan to provoke war had succeeded, convinced Congress to declare war on Mexico by telling them, quote, "American blood has been shed on American soil," unquote. Now, it was necessary to send Stockton to the Pacific coast to support the Texas game of John Fremont, the ambitious adventurer attempting to provoke war in California. The news of war with Mexico interrupted Fremont's blundering and the comic opera The Bear Flag Revolt. The two plotters, Stockton and Fremont, heroically occupied the territory in the face of almost non-existent opposition. The overall military plans of the United States revealed the real intentions of the Polk administration. While Taylor was attacking south into Mexico at the Texas border, Scott was simultaneously landing in Veracruz and then marched into Mexico City. Kearny was leading an occupation army through New Mexico and Arizona to meet in California with the Bear Flaggers. Finally, on the Pacific Ocean side, Sloat was to take over Mazatlan, then up the coast to San Diego. Manifest destiny had revealed itself as a well-planned, four-pronged military attack on Mexico, when all along the U.S. was stating the area of contention was the disputed Texas border region. It was not by accident that the United States spread as a broad belt across the continent in the 1840s. It was rather through clearly conceived policies relentlessly pursued that the United States achieved its empire to the Pacific, and Mexico lost half its lands. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the war between Mexico and the United States. In 1848, which had started with the invasion of Mexico by Zach Taylor, carrying out Polk's peace mission. The treaty ceded almost one-half of Mexico's territory to the United States, despite Polk's continual insistence that he did not desire any territory when he started the war. Many Mexicans chose to remain in the territory ceded to the United States because it was the only home they knew. In addition, they were guaranteed protection of their cultural heritage under the treaty. But these guarantees were quickly forgotten by the settlers rushing into the territory. The Mexicans were given the choice of Americanizing themselves and abandoning their culture, or going back where they came from, although most had been born in the territory. Article 9 of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo guaranteed those Mexicans staying in the ceded territories protection of property, civil rights, and freedom of religion. All the guarantees were systematically violated by the inrushing Anglo settlers who came in and controlled and imposed their rule on the Mexicano. The article is significant for it marks the first time in the United States entered into an agreement in the form of a treaty with a group in which there was recognition and guarantee for the preservation of the Mexicano's language, customs, traditions, civil rights, and religion. No other ethnic group in the United States had such a guarantee extended in the form of a treaty. Except for a few instances, all these guarantees have been grossly violated and overlooked. Yet the United States prides itself in its respect of treaty agreements. The culture, the language, and trade ties were too strong with nearby Mexico. In the resulting confusion, the Mexican became a minority where he had been formerly a majority, a foreigner on his own property. The land itself was not destined to remain his. The political institutions of the settlers and the unjust oppressive laws passed by the state and federal governments soon eroded his wealth and property. This was a violation of Article 10 of the treaty, with no consideration given to the legitimate claims of the property owners. The unjust burdens of proof were a continuation of the confiscatory aspects of the Texas game, which the United States government played so well. One of the most outstanding and unique conditions of the treaty had to do with the territory ceded to the United States. Although the United States had defeated the armies of Mexico and had placed an occupation force in the capital, Mexico was paid $15 million by the United States for this territory, which has to be looked upon as guilt money, since it was the first time that the victor had paid money to the conquered. What of the bitter legacy of the Mexican War? Though many scholars refrain from labeling the Mexican War a racist war, it's reasonable to point out the belief in white racial supremacy that was responsible for the justification of war. These attitudes which fostered the war were enforced by the United States victory. Many misunderstandings about the Mexican War have existed because historians were turning their attention to the Civil War, which began shortly thereafter. This war was fought to preserve the Union, was a direct result of the admission of Texas as a slave state. Another reason historians have been indifferent to the war is the guilt feelings of the United States. They do not want to condemn the United States for an aggressive war fought for the aggrandizement of territory. The violations of the Constitution and the insidious intrigues by Polk are an ugly blot on American history. His principal cohort, Stockton, financed his racist schemes in the name of peace, God, and manifest destiny. Stockton also tried to corrupt heads of government and raced to the Pacific coast to conspire with Fremont in the occupation of Mexico's Alta California. John Fremont, using his connections in the government, carried out schemes of avarice, ambition, and adventure in the name of patriotism and self-proclaimed heroism. Not everyone was in on the conspiracy. Abraham Lincoln lost his seat in Congress after he had opposed Polk's false claims, stating that their only positions are, first, that the soil was ours when the hostilities commenced, and second, that whether it was rightfully ours or not, Congress had annexed it, and the President, for that reason, was bound to defend it. Both of which are as clearly proved to be false, in fact, as you can prove that your house is mine, unquote. Another opponent was Ulysses S. Grant, who served under Zachary Taylor. He wrote in his memoirs, "We were sent to provoke a fight, but it was essential that Mexico should commence it. I was myself bitterly opposed to the measure, and to this day regard the war which resulted as one of the most unjust ever waged by a strong against a weaker nation." What were the results of this unjust, contrived war, provoked for the conquest of territory? Textbook after textbook, at all levels of education, continue to show the Mexicano as the aggressor, as the one who had to gang up at the Alamo in order to win. This distorted image places the Chicano child who reads about himself in a very negative perspective. He sees himself and his ancestors as villains in the history of the United States, when in reality it should be the other way around. Adjunct to this negative concept is a school teacher who identifies a Mexican villain with a Chicano student, thus compounding the erroneous distortions that textbooks relate. These misconceptions about the inferiority of the Mexican child and his ancestors are confirmed right before the Chicano and the Anglo student's eyes. Thus, early in life, the Chicano child receives a very distorted and biased picture of himself. The continued and flagrant violations of Articles 9 and 10 in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo establish the Mexican American as a vanquished man in the country of the victor. He is discriminated against, and as a result, he seeks out his own kind to preserve his culture, the only way to retain his identity and dignity. The Mexican War was a war for acquiring territory. It has never been seen as a great moral issue as was the Civil War. Since the Mexican War was not fought to liberate Mexicans, the legacy of the war is entirely different. Chicanos are not seen as a moral issue for the United States. They are simply seen as aliens. The guarantees of a system of bilingual education in the treaty have been violated for over 100 years by the attempts of the Anglo to Americanize the Chicano. Because the history books teach only one of superiority of the Anglos with no recognition of the contributions of the Mexicans, Chicano children are made to feel ashamed of their heritage. Because the English language is difficult and confusing, the Chicano child is pushed along in age groupings, forced into a pattern of failure until he gives up in despair and drops out of school. Many young Chicanos are drafted or volunteered into the armed forces in an attempt to escape from a seemingly hopeless future. Comprising approximately 5% of the population, Chicanos have suffered almost 20% of the casualties in the Vietnamese War. They are placed in the positions of highest danger, and often their escape from a hopeless future is only through death. The proximity of Mexico and the ease of travel helps the Chicano stay in touch and maintain ties with his native culture and traditions and heritage, thus rejecting any necessity to become Americanized in the great melting pot. Forced by discrimination in housing to cluster in the barrios, the Chicano is realizing the value of his culture and heritage. He seeks now to develop his spirit and dignity by embracing that culture. With the knowledge that he is strong enough to live biculturally, he asks for this opportunity through the implementation of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This will give Mexican children pride in their heritage and permit the Chicano to take his place with dignity amongst his peers. Thank you. We have presented a rather concise account of a revisionist perspective of a dark period in United States history that is beginning to illuminate itself with the help of revisionist historians and authorities on this era. In our introduction to the series, we commented on the subject of American public opinion and nativism. It is only through thoughtful, retrospective contemplation of our past actions and behavior as a nation of individuals that we can assess our true purposes and objectives. As American citizens caught up in the fervor of patriotism, we rationalize our acts and actions as logical and moral, irrespective of the end result. Thus, our guilt and national conscience are relieved. The next program will deal with the period following the Mexican-American War, specifically the period from 1848 to the 1930s. It will document the conflict that developed between the Anglo-American and the Mexicano as well as relating the Mexicano's struggle for determination and political control of his environment.